Southside Summit. And tonight's session, our first one, is about livability and safety. You're not going to hear much from me. I am delighted to turn it over to one of our amazing new board members, Lily Lamb, who will be the moderator, and she's going to take it from here. Thank you so much for being with us, and enjoy.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Lily Lamb. As Tabitha said, I'm a newly elected PPNA board member, so I'm delighted to be here and help moderate this really exciting and extremely timely topic for all of us to gather around. So just a couple quick housekeeping tips. I know that everyone is probably very familiar with virtual formats in this time of this year, but please do remember to mute yourself and mute your video as well. This session will be recorded, and we will have a portion for questions and answers at the end of the session, and I'll talk about agenda in just a second. But if at any point in time you want to jot a question in the chat box, you're welcome to, and that can come up during the Q&A later. So feel free to do that. You can also send them directly to Grace as well if you don't want to share your question publicly. So what are we going to be doing today? So we're going to have kind of a quick introduction from each of our panelists today. They're going to kind of talk about themselves, what brings them here, kind of some of the things that they think about or spend time doing in their lives. And then we are also going to have kind of more in-depth presentations. We are extremely lucky to be able to be joined by a phenomenal artist today who's actually going to be creating art in time with this session. And so we'll be bringing them in kind of midway through the session to be able to talk about that process and see what they're creating and co-creating along with us through this experience. We'll also have some questions that'll be taking place after the presentations. So we have some questions that kind of help guide discussion, and then we're going to have an open Q&A discussion as well. So I'm looking forward to it. I will try not to take up any more time and invite each of their panelists to introduce themselves. Like I said, my name is Lily Lamb. I use she, her, and I'm a PPNA board member, and I would love to hand it on over to Lex to introduce themselves, and then DA as well.
Thanks so much, Lily. It's so good to be here with you all. My name is Lex. I live in East Phillips. I was born and raised in St. Paul, but I've been on the south side of Minneapolis for the last 10 years. And yeah, I use he, him pronouns. I work with Reclaim the Block. Up until I stepped into this as more of my full-time role in the last month or two, I was working as a personal trainer, running a small business here right off of Lake Street. And yeah, have been living and organizing in this neck of the woods for about a decade. So really grateful to be here with you all.
Hello, everyone. Greetings. I'm DA Bullock. I'm a North Sider, but I'm here sharing Southside space with you. I am a professional filmmaker, documentary filmmaker. I've been that for over 20 years, and currently I'm the storyteller in residence at Pillsbury United Communities. And sort of the practice that I try to do mostly is what's called story-based organizing or story-based activism. And it's basically tying all our narratives and the way we pass down stories, both personal and sort of historical stories of communities from generation to generation. And then we supply a learning process through sharing those stories. And my goal is to sort of elevate those stories where they are the primary expertise and component in how we do public policy, because obviously public policy affects the way we live. And my theory is that our narratives and our stories that come from our communities should be the foremost expertise when we're forming public policy, even though we may not have gone to school as urban planners or what have you. We have the knowledge and we have the capabilities to build within communities.
Fantastic. Thanks for introducing yourselves, y'all. So I think we'll jump into presentations. And I have to admit, I'm not sure who's going first. So either it's decided or we'll decide it right here.
Yeah, I don't know either. Do you have a preference?
Oh, sorry. I would have a preference. Lex, if you want to do it first, that would be my preference.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Lex, take it away.
Cool. Thanks, y'all. I'm going to take a second to figure out sharing my screen with you all. All right. Y'all see a thing? I can't see you all, so I hope so. Cool. So again, I'm here today with Reclaim the Block and want to just share a little bit about Reclaim the Block and my role there, and yeah, how it relates to these conversations around safety. So Reclaim the Block is a campaign that started in 2018 here in Minneapolis. We're a Black-led and multiracial campaign, and the work that we're up to is about building up the resources that actually keep communities safe, and doing that by shifting the money and resources that the Minneapolis Police Department have been sitting on for decades back into the hands of community. And so our work is about trying to get more power into the hands of the people of Minneapolis, especially focusing on people who are impacted by the police, to shape how our city works and where our money goes. And the reason that we do that work is that we really believe, that most of us in Minneapolis want the same things. We want to live in safe communities where all of us can thrive, where people feel peace of mind because they have what they need, their basic needs are met, they know that their neighbors have what they need, and we believe that everybody should have someone they can call for help when they need it, and that those are the foundations of a safe city. My role in particular, I work, I'm called the Solidarity Organizer. What a title. So I work with communities around the city who aren't bearing the brunt of policing. So white folks, middle and upper class folks, business owners, et cetera, but who want to be part of this campaign, who see that the vision that we're offering of the city of Minneapolis is the one that they want more than the vision that the police are offering them. So figuring out ways for those folks to meaningfully be part of this work. And so that's my role. That's kind of the point that I'm speaking from. And what I'm going to get into next is kind of the nitty-gritty of what we do, which is helping people understand where our city's money goes and how that can impact how people can be part of that process. And first, I'm going to start with, like, why is that the angle that we take? So this is an image of a bunch of different cities around the country and sort of what has happened to police budgets over the last few decades. And I'm going to get back to that budget piece in just a minute, but the reason that we do the work we do and the way that we do it is that cities have been trying to reform the police for decades. I think especially since sort of the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s. There have been so many different police reforms tried, and it turns out that the police really cannot be reformed. That's what our study of history is telling us. Minneapolis Police Department in particular is a national poster child for police reform. So we have a progressive Black police chief, there are body camera policies, a litany of trainings for police, many different versions of community review boards that have been tried. And I think what we see over and over is that the police continue to do a great deal of harm and continue to kill Black people, as we've seen this summer and so many other times, right? And not only that, but also that the biggest issues that are facing communities in our city are also not being solved by the system. There's still alarmingly high rates of domestic violence, interpersonal violence, gun violence. This system that has been around for 150 years that claims to address those problems is also not mitigating them, right? And at the same time as we're seeing all these issues continue, we're also seeing that so many cities, almost every city in the country has given the police a raise year after year after year after year, even in the same years that those police departments have murdered people or have failed to produce any real safety for communities. There's no other job that I think any of us can think of where you can fail this miserably at what you are claiming you are here to do and get a raise every single year, right? If any of us did that in our day jobs, we would probably be unemployed pretty quickly. And so we see the budget as a tool to hold police accountable and to shift how safety works in our cities and our communities. And so that's what we're about. We are basically a bunch of budget nerds who are thinking about how do we organize people to become powerful through a boring ass city budget process, right? So I'm going to get specifically into Minneapolis for a minute. This is a great time to be having this conversation because our city is actually right in the midst of our city budget process, deciding where our money is going to go in 2021. So this is a perfect time to be thinking about how can the budget reflect our values as communities. So this is how the process works in Minneapolis, just a quick crash course. In September, Mayor Frey proposed a budget. He put out where he wanted the money to go in 2021. And now we're at this stage where there's going to be public hearings about the budget, where the city council takes public comment about where people want money to go. Those are the dates. I'll come back to those a little bit later. The council will make some changes to the budget and then send it back to Mayor Frey to sign it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Frey is proposing for where the money is meant to go in the city, because this is stuff that affects all of us and that many of us don't spend the time to read the 600-page budget document, right? So we try to break it down for folks. So overall, the city of Minneapolis every year is spending a little bit under $1.5 billion right now. We're mostly going to talk about these bricks over on the left side, the darker colored bricks, because that's the general fund. That's where there's the most discretion, where the mayor and the city council can kind of move things around the most. We aren't going to get as much into the rest of the money here. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that are important to me and that I think are important to a lot of us, where the city is spending money, and kind of show how much money is going there. So I'm going to start with affordable housing. As folks probably remember, Mayor Frey ran on a platform that was really heavy on affordable housing. Each one of these bricks represents $10 million, yeah? So as we go into this is the general fund. The mayor is proposing to spend about $8.5 million this year on affordable housing. It's a little bit less than one brick. We'll get into some other areas of the budget, like the fire department. Fire department's getting about $70 million this year. The health department in the midst of a pandemic is also something, right? Many of us are really interested in. The health department is also where all of the city's violence prevention programming lives. So the health department is getting about $24 million this year under the mayor's proposal. And finally, let's touch on civil rights. So the civil rights department is getting about $4.5 million this year. That's about half a brick. That's where a lot of the police oversight lives. That's a $1 million cut from last year. There's a lot of cuts this year due to COVID-19 budget shortfalls. So then I want to touch on how much is the Minneapolis Police budgeted to get this year. And I usually like to play this as a guessing game, but since I'm just talking at you and this isn't interactive, maybe just take a guess of what that number might be. This is MPD's budget going into 2021. Yeah, I don't know, that always feels like a gut punch when I see it. Maybe just notice what comes up for you when you see that number. Obviously there are some other things that aren't pictured here, but it's just a lot of money. It's almost $180 million. The main public conversation you'll hear about this is that it's a cut, that the MPD is getting a cut from last year, which is true. It's about a 7% cut, mostly due to police officers who are retiring. But that number brings us back to where the city was funding the police in 2018. So this is a pretty recent level of safety through policing, if that's the framework the city is using, that we're still at. We also want to emphasize, so we're going into the city budget process really trying to push the city council to look at where are ways that we could cut this number, this 179 million, pretty easily, even without making drastic changes to police staffing, although we do believe that that is needed over time. Where could we start now? So if you look at the left side of this table here, these are some places we've identified that the Minneapolis Police could cut some money that wouldn't lead to immediate changes in what their presence looks like on the street. They spend about $9 million on public relations, $7 million on SWAT raids, riot response, et cetera. If you picture that scene back on 94 last week, there's a lot of money going to those sorts of police responses. $3 million for the K-9 unit, almost $1 million for horse patrol in the year of 2020. And instead of proposing these kinds of cuts, what we're hearing from the police department is that this 7% cut is going to force them to do all these other things. They're going to delay their trainings, slow down response times, limit their responses to neighborhood issues, et cetera, right? To me, what this tells me is what the police are prioritizing responding to and doing. Again, this is at the staffing level they had in 2018, the budget level they had in 2018. So where I want to end in my last minute or two here is, I was going to get a little bit more in depth into some alternatives and some things that we can do instead. And I'm going to save that for, I think, in some of the Q&A, we'll get into that more. But what I want to emphasize is like inviting everybody here to imagine what could people in our communities do with $180 million to keep each other safe? Or what could we do with $1 million to keep each other safe, right? For most of us, those numbers are astronomical and like hard to imagine what we could do with that kind of resource. But if we think about the experts in our communities who are already mediating conflicts, who are already running elaborate mutual aid projects, there is so much that we could do to keep each other safe if we had even a slice of those resources. And we really look forward to a time when all of the things that help people meet their basic needs, like housing, like harm reduction services, like mental health response, like direct cash assistance during a pandemic, when those things are prioritized ahead of this system of policing that hasn't proven to us that it can actually keep folks safe. So I'll wrap it there and hand it over to DA. Thanks, y'all.
That was great. Thank you, Lex. That was fantastic. And it certainly is a good lead into what I'd like to discuss about the work I do at Pillsbury United Communities. I'll start with an introduction of Pillsbury United Communities, the organization. Can I share my screen here? I think so.
Yeah, you should be able to.
Great. So as you can see, Pillsbury United Communities is an agency that co-creates enduring change toward a just society built with and for people that we serve. Our united systems of programs, neighborhood centers, social enterprises empowers individuals and families across the region to own their future on their own terms. Now, what does that mean? Like, that's a nice slogan and catchphrase, but we like to talk about how we work and how our work intersects, and it intersects between the impact areas of people, place, and prosperity. And there are various examples of that sort of intersection amongst Wade House, where we do, the family stabilization on the South Side, and we do, there's a food shelf there. Clearly that's amongst people and amongst community-based support. Place, we're talking about the arts and community media, part of which is where I work, and that would include Pillsbury Theater, that would include North News, which is a newspaper that's dedicated to North Minneapolis, and that would include KRSM, which is a low-powered FM radio station, which is totally run by community members, and so the host and all the content is community-driven. And prosperity, we're talking about employment programs, we're talking about pathways, creating new pathways for communities to sort of build their own economic interest and work toward economic justice. We're in the midst of launching, the agency is in the midst of launching a community development arm to the organization, which would be about financing community dreams and hopes and aspirations. Meaning we need to be able to circumvent the current economic structure, which is structured through an individual has to go to a bank, or organization has to go to a bank in order to receive financing, or you have to be in the nonprofit structure in order to maintain financial stability. So we're trying to think of models outside of that to really develop around economic development that is centered within community and not solely reliant on outside sources, not outside philanthropy and not outside sort of the capital market system that is basically kept things like redlining and those kind of discriminatory practices in place. So how this all fits into our current work in the impact area, and what I want to show is a video as a part of the presentation, since I'm a filmmaker. I should show a video. I wanted to show an episode of our series that we just launched called Reimagining Public Safety. And we launched this series after the murder of George Floyd, and with the distinct reason that we knew that there was going to be a lot of conversation about what should and shouldn't happen as a result of that, like, sort of historic, worldwide, impactful, tragic event. But we also knew that if we relied on the traditional media sources, that we'd only get a partial glimpse of the story of what people were actually saying, what people were actually desiring. And then we wanted to be able to interject those stories. Again, going back to my introduction, we wanted to be able to interject those stories into the discussion of public policy. So I'll start the video, and then I'll talk a little bit about, this is one episode of the video, but I'll talk a little bit about why we did an episodic series and why we want to sort of keep this conversation going from a community generated standpoint.
We might not have the audio for the video working.
Oh, is that right? Let's see. What do I have to do in order to route the audio? Is there
I think, let me see if I can find it really quick to guide you a little bit. I think it's
sorry about that.
Screen. I think when you start sharing your screen, if you click the advanced menu, there's a little bit more guidance through Zoom about clicking include computer audio.
Share computer sound?
Yep.
Is that okay? Let's see.
That sounds right.
Let's try that.
And then just don't hit mute on Zoom. Don't mute your mic while we watch.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me fix that. Apologies. Let's try this again. Okay.
Reformed?
Is that?
Yep, that's working.
All right,
We have asked many community members.
When we talk about reimagining public safety, it's important to know where we are. Where has our current imagination led us? We begin with a simple idea.
Is the Minneapolis Police Department able to be reformed? We have asked many community members with different sets of deep and resonant experiences to weigh in on this question.
So when we're thinking about reform with our Minneapolis Police Department, I don't currently feel like there is the bandwidth, the capacity for reform at this point. I think that in future engagements and experiences and situations and all of that in the past, like there were opportunity for reform, but at this point, I think that the issues are so deep-rooted that it's time to completely deconstruct the entire Minneapolis Police Department.
I believe they can be reformed, but I do think there needs to be more training involved. I think there needs to be a different way of the system that it works, because right now it's so discombobulated. I don't think, it's just not safe right now.
No, I do not think that the Minneapolis Police can be reformed.
There is no question that policing can't stay the same.
I don't believe that the system can reform itself. The Minneapolis Police Department is not capable institutionally of reforming itself.
When we look at the history of the state of Minnesota, there has only been one officer who has been convicted for shooting a civilian, and that was a black man, Muhammad Noor. Even though the state of Minnesota is 85% white, most of the officers who shoot and kill people are white men, but again, not a single one has been held accountable criminally for shooting and killing a civilian.
There's no question about that. I think the question is, how do we transform policing? How do we make policing an extension of the community itself.
There's no time for giving extra chances. We've given enough, especially in my 37 years of living, we've given enough chances, enough funding, enough resources, enough opportunity and capacity that it's time to completely dismantle the entire structure and start over.
I actually have had a very bad encounter with the police when I was 12 years old. Yes, I do. I was in St. Paul. I was on the train station, and they told me that I was lying about my age because of how I looked. And they told me get in the police car. I felt really like, I didn't have a phone at this time, so I couldn't call my mother, so I felt kind of, overpowered. So I asked him, isn't there a way you can look me up in the school system, anything? I'm 12 years old, like what am I doing wrong? He told me I was in trouble because I lied about my age, and he took a picture of me. And I don't know if that was right or not.
Well, first of all, I think we have to be reformed. The police work for us. We believed them when they said that the guy they killed was a bad guy because he had a record, and that even though it happened at night, there were no witnesses. We believed them wholeheartedly. I did, and I was a council member. I believed them, and so we have to take responsibility that we deployed them in our community and did not put proper checks and balances, did not fight enough against the union grit that they won every time, and we lost our young people.
And so there's always the us against them, rather than the us working together, the all of us working together to deal with the issues of crime in our community. Without question, the police are responding to some calls that others would be better suited responding to.
Well, I mean, we've seen the attempts over the years, and I think one thing that was interesting is that in the wake of the Jamar Clark of the 4th Precinct occupation, there were people and counselors too, city councilors involved with that, who had a paranoid sense that their constituencies were literally being punished by the police, by the Minneapolis police force for dissenting, for disagreeing.
And so how do police and community, civilian and sworn officers really begin to respond, have a complete response together? I believe that is possible for the Minneapolis Police Department only because of the chief and the administration.
Time again, we haven't seen much change at all, and there's just a lot of systemic problems with it. I mean, when you think about it, just a stat was thrown out there that 8% of Minneapolis police actually reside in Minneapolis, and how are you going to have officers who don't live in the communities protect and serve them properly and don't know the environment? And it's yeah, I mean, just things need to change, really.
When I first heard about abolishing the police, I was fearful too. Being a single woman, living in my own home, there was a part of me that didn't feel safe because we have community members who aren't the safest, and we have to really peel back that onion. Let's look at the layers. What caused community members to engage in reckless or risky activity? Let's really look at this holistically. And people are engaging in risky behaviors to get basic needs.
In the coming weeks, this episodic series will explore many of the ways we are reimagining public safety right now. We will have conversations about how we invest our dollars in modes of public safety. We will discuss how we can truly rid our communities of violence.
We will talk about laws that criminalize our survival. We can express the importance of having a secure home as part of safety. We can discuss public health as it relates to safety. We can imagine a whole new form of responsibility and accountability to each other. And we will ask how, if at all, does the Minneapolis Police Department and the people who make it up fit into the future of public safety in our city?
So why do storytelling or story sharing or story collection, it seems pretty anecdotal. Everybody's got their own slant on things. Everybody's got their own opinion about things. But when you do this kind of story organizing and story collection, what you start to reveal is you're peeling back some of the layers that are layered upon political ideology and identity and what is at the core of what people are really arguing about or saying. And interestingly enough, you know, we featured several people in that video that we knew were proponents of increasing the police budget, because I wanted to talk to them directly about, so what are you really a proponent of? Is it a proponent of this system, or are you a proponent of some component of it, or are you fearful of change? And you start to see some of that, the depth and the nuance of why people choose a certain political stance or a certain policy stance is more deeply rooted in the kind of concepts that we would all want for each other, which is often people were clamoring for more police. We're actually clamoring just for more safety. We're clamoring for more peace of mind and the ability to have someone to call that they trusted. So those are the components that obviously we work on when we are designing new systems, when we are letting old systems go and die that are not working and providing those things. I think, you know, Pastor Horan even mentioned the only reason he has this faith in the Minneapolis Police Department is because of his relationship with the chief. And I asked him, you know, so what happens if the chief leaves? Is like, so does that all dissolve, or does it change for you instantly? And, you know, he thought about it for a while and he said, yeah, it would probably change the nature of my support. So I think we have to use the stories. We have to use this sharing of communication that is, you know, the history of humankind is sort of built on this, of how we share valuable survival, how we share valuable ways of doing social contracts. And that's what really affects developing the best public policy. So I'll end it there, because I'd really be interested in how we open this up and having more of a conversation. I'm not big on doing presentations. I like conversations.
Thanks for that, DA. So I think before we get to conversation, I'm going to invite Julie, who's our artist for this session, to kind of share what you've got going on. Julie, do you want to introduce yourself? And
Hi, I'm Julie Zhao, and I was painting while I started painting while Lex was talking, and then I just continued while, is it DJ? While DJ was talking, because I mean, I think originally we talked, DA, sorry. We talked about doing two paintings, but it just didn't seem to work that way. So at one point, Lex talked about, of course this isn't finished because, you know, just a sketch sort of, but Lex talked about safety and this, I was thinking of this feeling of, you know, just the layers of community, like at the center of the spiral is sort of the self, and then there's your family, neighborhood, the police or the world, and also as a symbol of transformation and change. And when Lex said that the Minneapolis Police Department isn't capable of change, and you know, there has to be a lot that goes into change. So there is, you know, that really I felt was important, to think of all those levels that would need to take place in order to make a serious, sustainable change. You know, and so without agreeing or disagreeing, I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of layers to it. And it's about movement and energy. And of course, this is like very conceptual and not really meant to send any specific message as to how I feel about it. It's about change and transformation in general.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that, Julie. I love the bright colors to it. I would encourage anyone else who's participating along with us, if you want to send a feeling that you had or a reaction that you had during our presentations from our two panelists, go ahead and chat that in the type it in the chat, and you can share that with Julie as well if you want to kind of give her your perspective of your experience. I want to kick us off with some questions and kind of get into some more. So Julie, we'll let you mute yourself if you'd like, if you want to keep working.
Okay. Yeah, I'll keep working as I listen. This is great. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. So I want to kind of start us off to DA and Lex here with this idea of, and I love the perspective that Julie kind of brought in terms of those layers of ourself, our community, how many people are really involved in this conversation. When we think about something as big as public safety and personal safety, there's just a whole lot of complexity and layers that come into it. So when we're talking about community members constructively having conversations about reforming, defunding, abolishing the police, obviously all three of those are very different theories, different practices. People might have different understandings of what those words mean to them. What are some of the ways that you two kind of think that community members can really engage in those conversations in a productive or in a useful or fruitful way with each other? Don't both talk at once.
I could start, and so again, like in order to be a professional filmmaker, documentarian, you have to be a decent listener, and I feel like we should all develop our listening practice, particularly around conflict, right? We don't get trained a lot in conflict resolution, and we're not even talking about the extreme acute conflict where people are about to really like go at each other and harm each other. I'm talking about like the way we handle conflicting ideas and conflicting thoughts, and even some of the things that conflict with our own sort of personal image or self-image that we have of ourselves, which is you come into play in a conversation like this, whereas that the police are doing historical harm and have done so over time and have not shown particular way of reforming themselves when it comes to these issues. So everyone on this call probably knows that particularly another person of color, another Black person is going to be killed by the Minneapolis Police Department sometime within the next few years. Like, we know that almost for a fact, yet we're still reluctant to make the move of whether we defund that police department or we abolish that police department, even though we know as good people ourselves that they will potentially, do the same kind of harm in the very near future. That's a cognitive dissonance that people have to really deal with and be able to come to a conversation honestly and admit, that at times your fear may override even your knowledge that this is not working, right? So then we were able to sort of unpack some of those conversations by having a practice and an approach about how we approach some of these difficult conversations. I think, obviously one of the things is being honest, but the other thing is being vulnerable enough and sort of not conflict averse enough to step into discomfort, to step into some of these places where you do feel fear or you do feel just reticence because this is something you've never imagined before or something you've never considered before.
Yeah, thanks for that, DA. Yeah, I think Yeah, I think I've seen this summer, and so many of us have, just like, what are the muscles to have a really difficult conversation about this stuff that we are still collectively really needing to build. And yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think one piece I would add is, like, I think there's a really strong, like, mainstream cultural narrative that just puts a bunch of things together. That's like, if there's a problem, it's for the police to solve. And if it's not for the police to solve, there's no solution. And sort of like, it's all right. It's all collapsed together. And one thing that we've been trying to do in having conversations with people about this work is, like, invite folks to think about, and I guess I would invite all of you on the call to try this on too, and then maybe try it when you have a little bit more time, of like, what are the situations either where you might call the police, or you know that the police get involved in a situation, and just imagine what those are. And then kind of take them apart a little bit. Like, which of those situations are actually not really a problem and don't need a response at all, right? So just like, maybe it's like a noise complaint where you could just go knock on your neighbor's door instead. Or maybe it's like a racist Karen calling the police on like a bunch of young Black people who aren't causing anyone harm, right? There's a chunk of things that like no one needs to deal with. These are not problems, right? And then there's a bunch of things that they are problems, but most of us can think of better solutions than like an armed force, right? Like, I think mental health crises have really risen to the top around this, right? Like, most of us, if our loved one is having a mental health crisis, would rather have a mental health expert responding to that than the police, for example. Or if there's an encampment at a park near you where people are living outdoors because they don't have a place to live, to me, a better response to that is for those people to have a place to live. If there's a safety issue there, then for the police to bust up that encampment, right? Those kinds of issues. And then the third category is like, where are the places we're stuck? We actually don't know what the answer is if it's not calling the police. Maybe this is this is going to be different for everyone, right? Maybe for you, it's domestic violence. Maybe it's gun violence. Maybe it's when there are white supremacists who are armed and who are not police, who are moving through our communities like they were earlier in the summer and threatening people. These are some situations that are really tough. And like, first, we can just name that we're stuck around that, and that's okay. And then ask, like, is everyone stuck around this, or are there people who actually do know some things about how to address this situation without calling the police? Because often there are, right? Like, I'm not an expert in any of those things, but I'm lucky enough to like have met some people who know and are already doing it formally or informally, right? Responding to domestic violence and preventing it before it happens, for example. And then how can we draw on the knowledge that those people have more? And then finally, where are the places we really are just stuck, right? That we really don't have another option. And then let's just be honest about that and really put some sweat into what can we do to figure out and experiment around these issues. And I don't know what that will look like, but I know that right now that'll take the number of issues that we are relying on police to respond to from here, maybe down to like way down to here. And to me, that's a good start, you know? And everyone's gonna have different answers. And I've been just trying to talk to my neighbors about that stuff, right? Like, what are our different options? And I think that can just help us spark our creativity for what can we demand gets more resources, what are experiments we wanna try, and then know that some of those experiments aren't gonna work, right? The police have had 150 years and billions of dollars on an experiment that has very little success in the grand scheme of things. So we get to expect that our experiments should get resources for an extended period of time to try to play with them and see what is effective. But I think that this muscle of like our imagination and of what are the real ingredients for safety just for most of us has been like a little underworked. So just trying on and problem solving through these different situations can bring us so much further in the conversation.
And I could add, know that, you know, when we're transitioning from one sort of system that's been in place for a long time to another that is fairly new, there's never been a point where that new system has been totally fully formed before we moved into it, right? So understand that I think it was like right before 1900, the city of Minneapolis had a huge budget for horses, right? It was like, as we were trying to transition into this new form of you know, transportation, which would be vehicle transportation, you know, it was a struggle. It was a struggle to understand like exactly how that was going to work, and it didn't really work that well at first. But we knew that is where the future was. We were headed toward. So you know, we were slowly moving out of that old system into a new system, even though the new system was not fully formed. So you don't have to be afraid that we don't have the entire plan mapped out with every contingency mapped out in order to move into a new system.
There we go with that idea of change and transformation again. I love it. All right, so thinking about so we're thinking about crime and violent crime, which is something that currently the police kind of hold in terms of our community safety. What are some of the resources that you think are critical to preventing violent crime in our communities? Lex, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I've spoken to this a little bit, but so I think, right, there's prevention and then there's response. And I think just to emphasize first that prevention, I think talking about prevention at all is like such an important place to begin. And it's something that really is missing in our current system, is that the conversations about how do we prevent violence are really getting short shrift compared to how do we react when violence happens, right? And I think we need both, but let's start with prevention first. Yeah, so I think first, like basic needs stuff, right? Housing, harm reduction, in the middle of a pandemic, direct cash assistance to people, right? Just sort of the things that make sure that people have what they need so that they don't need to steal from another person to feed their family or to pay their rent, things like that. And then I do want to spend a minute on violence, on response to violence, just because I think this is like such an urgent question for people. And I want to shout out like a couple models that are inspiring to me. And again, none of these are perfect or are the answer to everything, but I think are like good places to start. So in Southern California, there's a program called CAT 911 that's getting started. That's like an alternative to 911 that's hooking up community members with emergency response resources if they can't or don't want to call the police. A lot of folks have heard about the CAHOOTS model, which is out of Eugene, Oregon, which is taking mental health crises emergency response out of the police response system and moving it to emergency medical services workers and mental health workers to respond to mental health crises when they happen, or to overdoses or substance use crises. There's also some great programs doing like restorative justice and community accountability work. Like a pretty institutionalized one is called Common Justice in New York. So if there's a person who experiences like a pretty serious form of violence, maybe like a assault or robbery or burglary, if the survivor of that experience, of that harm, agrees to it, they'll go through a circle mediation process with the person who caused that harm and come to some set of agreements about what the person who caused harm needs to do. And if that person follows through on all of those agreements for like a year or two, they then don't go to prison. And I think, I don't have any of the data in front of me, but I think that stuff is often found to be so much more effective. Obviously not just in keeping that person out of prison, which to me is like a win in and of itself, but also just in preventing future violence from happening. And then finally, there's also like really powerful work that is like really under-resourced happening around like domestic abuse transformation programming, which is like when folks have used abuse or violence in an intimate partner relationship, what's the work that can happen with that person so that they don't do it again? There's lots of great organizations here in Minnesota who are doing that work, but it's often so, again, under-resourced compared to the rest of their work. And I think we need to really pump some of that stuff up. So those are a few things I would point to.
Yeah, I 100% concur that Lex, that was a great list. And then we'll break it down a little bit on the sort of things that are right in front of us that we can really like reach, which is like the budget hearing that will happen next week and in December. We could start to look at really, the city of Minneapolis, how we spend our money. Do we actually spend money on prevention, which we don't? I'm going to share a graphic from the third episode in our series, which is examining the budget of the city of Minneapolis. And so if I know you may have disabled my sharing, can I
Yep, let me fix it quick here.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, all good.
Throwing you all curveballs. All right, so I'm going to share this graphic, and this was created by Pollen, who is our partner in doing this work. So you can see this is really like a very simple breakdown of how, similar to what Lex showed us earlier, but some of the individual line items of sort of what do we invest in as a city? Like, what do we really believe is important? And so you could see the police department's budget broken down into their various parts, but you can also see the health department's breakdown. First of all, you see the disparity between the two numbers. The original 2020 budget for the city of Minneapolis Police Department was 193 million, and as Lex discussed, that's been reduced because of COVID revenue. But originally that was what was budgeted for this year, was 193 million, and 24 million on the health department side. And you'll see a line in the health department is the Office of Violence Prevention. So we spent $2.5 million roughly on violence prevention, yet we say that is the ultimate most important thing in why we want to keep this $193 million apparatus in active as a public safety feature. So we could just examine those kind of imbalances. Those are fairly simple things that we can do right that are right in front of our face, and say and ask, our leadership, ask our elected leaders, why is this? Why are we doing this? Why are we continuing to invest our money like this, when we would all rather be if we were the potential victim of a crime, we would all rather have that prevented than some large-scale law enforcement that would catch the person that perpetrated that crime against you, because it still leaves you in a place of trauma. It still leaves you in a place where you need to be healed. You don't gain much out of that law enforcement. In our society, it's arguable about what the exact gain out of just the enforcement component of it. So one thing we can do is really just look at the numbers and really see, is it adequate to spend less than $70,000 on senior services. I know the county takes over a lot of those services, but this is our city budget, and we should have more control over and participation in the decisions that this budget reflects on our priorities, on our values, on our goals as living together. So this is a place I just point to directly and say, is that an adequate division of resources in your mind, without any kind of political stance? If you look at that, does that look right to you? So I'll stop sharing here. Yeah.
That segues perfectly into the next question that I have for both of you. So briefly talk about, in your opinion, kind of what a livable and safe community looks like that limits the negative disparities among communities of color and low wealth folks. So when we imagine something different than what we have now that clearly doesn't meet that, what does it look like to you? DA, do you want to take us away?
Sure. It looks like your best suburbs, right? Which is take the racial dynamic of your best suburbs out of it, although we cannot do that. This is America. But imagine why those suburbs work the way they do. They don't work the way they do because they have an exorbitant amount of police. Often some of the richest suburbs in the country don't have police forces. You can look that up yourself. You'll see how many of them share police forces with other jurisdictions. And the reason that is not because they just happen to house a bunch of people who are better than the rest of us. It's because everyone in those communities you know, they don't have housing insecurity. They don't have food insecurity. They don't have economic insecurity. They have the type of living and thriving that is guaranteed to them based on their birthright, based on who they were born to and the place they were born and their racial background. But they have certain guarantees in life that they don't ever have to question. They don't ever have to think about that. They don't ever have to have this mentality about survival that you often see in communities that are stressed with community violence. So the simple answer is if we work to eradicate those disparities and that those living conditions, then quite easily we're going to be able to face community violence and crime as an issue. Because again, it's not about sort of how are we redesigning people. People are, you know, designed the same way, whether regardless of your condition that you were born in, but you know, people react to the conditions that they live in. And so you took any person from those suburbs and you put them in the same conditions, born in the same conditions, generationally trapped in the same conditions, then you would see their behavior would be very much like anyone that you're currently afraid of. So I would just say like that, really look to these suburban communities and don't look at them like, wow, it's a vision of what we could have, but look at it like, well, why is that the way it is? And you'll start to see like the way they invest their city services are quite a bit different. They invest a lot more in amenities. They invest a lot more in people's well-being. All the things that, you know, I think if we put those investments in the right place, you would see a significant change in the way community violence is enacted.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, yeah, something very similar, right? In the wealthiest country in the world, every single person should have a safe place to live and food on their table and well-funded schools, access to healthcare. There's just no excuse for people to not have that in the United States, right? And yeah, and of course, you know, Minneapolis as a city can't single-handedly turn around that pattern in the United States. But I think there's a lot that we can do here in our city and in our communities. Yeah, and I think the reason that Minneapolis sometimes gets called nationally the Minneapolis miracle is that there are a lot of white people in Minneapolis whose lives look like what DA just described, you know, and then there's a lot of poor folks and Black and brown folks in the city who don't have access to that version of Minneapolis. And the only asterisk I would put on that is like, as somebody who grew up kind of in and out of suburbs like that, and with going to school in suburbs like that, is just like that those same issues of domestic violence, of addiction, of harm between people are happening in those communities. It's just that they are not getting policed for them, and that they're happening on private property behind closed doors, right? And so that there's also this level of that's not our dream, and that we want that level of resources for everybody, but we also want the kind of like deeper healing and transformation that's needed so that yeah, so that kind of interpersonal harm isn't happening anywhere, whether or not people are going to prison for it. But yeah, I think we have the money and the resources to create that for so many more folks in our city than we're doing now. There actually isn't the amount of scarcity, you know, especially in the pandemic. I think the narrative of scarcity and austerity about how there's not enough money is so strong. And there's a lot of money in our city. There's a lot of money in our county. There's a lot of money in this country.
Right.
Yeah, to get all of us what we need.
Thanks, you two. All right, so we're gonna hop on over to our audience questions, and Grace has been doing a great job of kind of fielding them as they come in. So our first question is, given the recent rejection of the charter amendment and the council allocation for additional police funding in 2020, where are you two individually or through your organizations focusing your advocacy efforts moving forward? And how do we support this work in our neighborhoods?
I can start. I love that question. Come through to the city budget hearings in the next couple weeks. There's one on Monday. The first one is at 10 a.m. on Monday, one on December 2nd, one on December 9th. And talk about what you want to see in your neighborhood and your community, right? Also send some emails, make some phone calls to the entire city council. I think a lot of the folks who are most comfortable navigating the city apparatus are the ones who are speaking up the most often. And so we need the rest of us to also be loud and speaking up. And yeah, we are continuing the work of, I think we were always clear that there was not going to be any big public announcement this summer that was going to overnight actually change the conditions around policing in Minneapolis. I think that we all know that the Fraternal Order of Police is too entrenched in the city for it to happen like that. But we're in long haul work to slowly move money out of the police department and get it back into the hands of people who can use it better, and to support people who are building up the community alternatives that we need so much. So yeah, stay plugged into us. Reclaim the Block on social media and however else, and we'll stay tuned. But the budget process that's happening right now is like the first and foremost opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. And I would say, now that you are here and now that you are interested, stay engaged, and meaning, stay as a part of this conversation, stay in the thoughtful part of this conversation, which is, I think, just like Lex just mentioned, right, none of this happens overnight. So if you think about it in terms of your own thought process, like what questions are you asking yourself now that you weren't asking yourself, before May 25th, and continue to share those thoughts and those questions with your neighbors, and sort of, don't think of like, if I'm not totally 100% in one political framework mind or not, then I don't have any thing to add to it. It is the process of coming to a place, and whatever place you're coming to, it is what is about what's best for you, your family, and your community. So I trust that we're all going to be evolving to the right place, but it is an evolution. It does take steps, and it does take us staying engaged. What I would ask is people is not to accept the old answers, right? So there was a set of old answers that we were given all along every time something like this happened, and then we sort of tacitly or actively accepted all those old answers and said, yeah, well then that's the only thing we can do. We can't do anything because the police union is so strong. It's like all those kind of old tropes and old answers. Don't accept any of those. Ask the next question, which is, well, why have we been beholden to a police federation for all this time? Why haven't you all changed it? Or if it is Bob Kroll alone, why has it been the same when it was John Delmonico? And, so then you start to ask those sort of in-depth questions, I think the challenge then is put back into the place of people in power, that they know they cannot just give you the same old tired answers and rote answers. Then they actually have to have a thoughtful conversation with you down the line.
So our next audience question here, I think, feeds really nicely into that, which is thinking forward to the coming changes in Washington. What are some common needs that the federal government can provide across communities? So obviously we're looking at really things at the city level here, but what are some of the maybe kind of larger federal realities that could help to move this conversation along as well?
Sure. I mean, I would say push for your dreams that are attainable, which means concepts like universal health care and a universal basic income are attainable, and they're also your part of a dream that would create a safer environment, right? So when we keep coming back to these same ideas, which is that people who are not in survival mode and that kind of base lizard brain instinctual mode, they are able to make better decisions. They are able to do all these things, right? And then when we realize that the cost of that is even less than what we're spending now, whether that be on private insurance or whether we're spending now on an unemployment insurance system that doesn't really quite work that well. If we could push for some of these other things that will end up helping more people and bringing the level up of their living and thriving up to a certain degree, those are the kind of things that we push on a federal level. Those are the type of things that we push even people in our own political parties to move forward and closer to our dreams and desires, because they are attainable. They're not far-fetched and far off, and they won't cost us too much money. And I know, again, it's like all these old excuses. We can't accept those old excuses anymore.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add on that. I think just continuing to like drive home that meeting people's basic survival needs is politically possible, and we have the resources for it, you know? And I think just like, as DA is saying, pushing back on that lie every time we hear it, you know, that we actually like could afford to like pay everybody to stay home for the next 6 weeks to really change the course of this pandemic. We can afford to totally transition our economy to really start to reverse climate change. We can afford for everybody to have healthcare. And I believe that those kinds of platforms are what are going to bring the most people along with us. I don't think that's like divisive or radical to push people on like what we need and deserve. And yeah, I think that love the idea of that coming all the way down from a federal level. I think we're gonna have to push to get it under this administration, but I think it's worth pushing, and I think it's possible.
So continuing to kind of think broader, our next question is how does the movement to reform, defund, or abolish the police relate to the new Jim Crow of prisons and private profiteering of prisons? Ooh, say that 10 times fast. Thoughts on any reform there, or kind of the intersections between these two conversations broadly?
I can start briefly and then pass it to DA. Yeah, I think these are deeply connected, right? Every prison sentence, and also pretty much every deportation while we're at it, starts with an arrest, starts with police contact. So I think part of our work is about how do we weaken the funnel that's putting so many people into those systems that most people will never get out of once they're in them. They will stay in contact with a prison, with parole, with deportation, with ICE for the rest of their lives once they've come in contact through police, you know? And I think maybe the analysis from the new Jim Crow that feels most resonant for this conversation right now to me is like that these are not broken systems. They're systems that are doing what they were built to do. And once we start treating them that way, we will come to better answers than if we think like we have to keep finding the tweak that's going to make them work better. I think they're working very efficiently, but very violently, you know? And then I think just quickly, I would say like, I think there's a lot that's complicated about sort of private profiteering off of prisons. I think most prisons are public institutions, and I think the money-making mechanisms are often more complicated than that. But I think looking at the huge amount of public resource that is going into these punishment-oriented systems is what I'm most interested in.
Yeah. Clearly, all the carceral systems are intertwined, and I would even extend that to, in my neighborhood, there's like a preponderance of check cashing places versus where you get payday loans and those kind of things versus, financial institutions where you have a relationship with somebody where they can build on their dreams, right? I consider that also part of the carceral systems, right? So I think what we do is really examine how those things work together and sort of how they draw out a map for someone's life, whether they deserve that life or not. And again, it goes back to the type of things that we invest in that we just sort of take for granted. The city of Minneapolis, for instance, has no sort of reentry investment. about people who come back to communities. So basically, we're drawing a map for them to stay in criminal behavior if we're not drawing a map for them to be outside of that antisocial behavior, right? So even if you're not thinking of it as an altruistic motive, which is like everybody, I want everybody to do well, even if you're thinking of it as totally as a selfish motive of wanting your city experience to be optimal, think about it, how it connects to those systems then. Because if someone is getting out of that system, that prison system, that carceral system, and they're coming back to a map that forces them to be, basically forces them or draws them an area to be in within criminal behavior again, ultimately one day that will impact you, perhaps even personally and physically. So it behooves us all to really be invested in divesting from all those systems, shifting from all those systems, coming into something that really restores people back to their communities. We've had a great deal of, even before George Floyd was murdered, there was a great deal of work around the narrative of pushing youth out of downtown, especially Black and brown youth, right? Because they're trouble, they're loud, they're potentially dangerous. The police had this whole campaign last year. I don't know if you all remember, but it was like showing videos of drunk white people out having a good time, getting their cell phones taken from them from groups of Black kids marauding downtown. So there's been a lot of investment in this narrative that downtown is dangerous because of these kids, right? People don't explicitly say it's because of the Black kids, but that's all in the implied the layer of that narrative, how it's laid out. So even if you're coming from that standpoint, which I'm not accusing anybody of coming from that standpoint, but even if you're coming from that standpoint of I'm scared to be in the downtown, then you have as much to gain by investing in the destruction of those carceral systems and the destruction of all those systems that create this map for people's activity to stay in one place. You have as much to gain of that as I do, who I want to gain by that with, I want my kids to be able to hang out in North Minneapolis. I don't need them to hang out downtown, right? I want them to hang out in a place. I want to invest in North Minneapolis because I want them to stay here and hang out and be loved here. You might want them to hang out in North Minneapolis because you don't want to see them and they bother you, right? So, I mean, I'm just being real about this. Like, I think there is a place where people who are consider themselves center, moderate type political thinkers need to start thinking expansively about how to achieve their goals as well as the goals of other people. Because I think I've gotten tired of trying to see the altruism in other people or make sure that is happening. Because we just had 70 million people vote for Donald Trump. So I'm not feeling that altruism greatly, but I do feel like there's a transaction there to be made. And I think that's something we can work on about why these systems really affect all of us in a negative way.
I think that actually brings me really nicely around to this this last question that we're going to have, which is really recognizing that these can be really uncomfortable conversations for some people. And so what advice do you have for talking about defunding the MPD within institutions? So specifically thinking about, nonprofits that we might be involved with, schools, neighborhood groups, et cetera. You might have a wide, diverse population, and especially ones that might be uncomfortable with the idea of it. They might be kind of scared about it or worried about staying in their lane or it not being something that they should be addressing. Any kind of closing thoughts on that from the two of you?
I forgot who's going first.
Yeah, why don't you kick us off and then we'll finish up with Lex.
I say, and I'm not usually this cynical, but I'll just be cynical today because maybe that's where I am. I would say, firstly, people have to push past discomfort. Like, I'm originally from Chicago, so I have sort of a different culture around conflict and being able to argue with people, and then we still hug each other and love each other at the end of the day. And there's no hard feelings, and we're not carrying that 3 months later. And I know that's a little bit different in Minnesota. It's a little bit more tension and conflict averse. I would say push past the conflict aversion, and that's not that you're seeking out argumentation, but you're seeking out just again more questioning the premise of how a lot of these things are built. And I think internally in a lot of these organizations, they rely on our self-image of, okay, I'm a great person, or I'm a good person, and you know, I have the best intentions at heart. So I think we really have to push those. We have to push back on some of those sort of assumptions in our general philanthropy and our general politics, because we're a majoritarian city, which means most of the people in this city are of the same political persuasion. So that means there's a lot more push you have to do against people who you consider your allies. There's like push you have to do against people who are close to you and you have an affinity for. I think that's where this critical mass starts to shift, because then you're asking tough questions of people that, you know, you generally agree with. Then you're asking tough questions about how people are speaking one way, but then their actions might be a different way, you know. And then you start to challenge some of the basic things that hold the status quo together, which is this sort of fallback to, yeah, well, we all want police reform. I've heard that like 1,000 times, like in the last even week. But then, you know, my question to people when they say that, well, we all want police reform, is like, well, what do you want them to do? What exact change do you want to see in them? And is that really something you want to leave up to them to do that internally or by some magic? And what have you seen in the past that leads you to believe that they would make that change? And then, so you start to ask, again, like a number of questions amongst people that are allied that really starts to push this forward. It's one thing to sort of see yourself as diametrically opposed to, whether that be right-wing white supremacy, or, you know, some of that kind of like boogeyman stuff. It's like that's easy to oppose. Everybody opposes that, at least in public, like in their public image. What I find is the most difficult, and the things that I want to challenge people to do, is that opposition to that person that's a lot closer to you, that is a lot more complicated and a lot more complex, that you know needs to be pushed. Those are the kind of challenges and conversations and conflicts that I think we all are responsible to have, if we are honest when we're saying we don't ever want to have George Floyd happen again. Not just the murder of the man, which was terrible and horrific, but what it did to us as a city. Like, that was all because of the activity of a group of people who were doing something in our name. So we have responsibility there. We have responsibility to never let that happen again. So we have to push that responsibility. We have to hold that and carry that responsibility, whether we want to or not. I mean, that's something we really have to do, as we're a social unit. We have a contract with each other. We have to do that. It's a must.
Yeah. I think what I would add, or just a couple other directions that come to mind for me, I guess the first one I'll speak to is not for every institution, but feels like for me, the ones that I feel most responsibility for, which is like majority white or white run institutions, which is a lot of the institutions in this town, but not everyone. So it's a different dynamic. But I think this summer we saw like historic levels of support, including among white people, for the movement for Black Lives, and just sort of like a peak in how many people total, including white people, were sort of like here for it. And I think we know from studying history, like how quickly that falls off when the movement leaves the headlines. And so I think for folks who are in majority white or white-led institutions, the work is so much about just like keeping the conversation up and not letting it fall off. So whether it's like really debating the points of defund or not, which, of course I would love for people to be doing, but not letting white supremacy and like state violence leave the conversation once George Floyd's murder isn't in the headlines anymore, feels like so much of the work, and the consistency. And then I think the second piece, which I think is maybe applicable more broadly from my experience, is just like, how do we get the conversation to be as concrete as possible? I think sometimes it can be tempting to be like, how do I get my organization to make a public statement in support of defunding the Minneapolis Police? And I think there are some situations where that's helpful, but then I think there are some situations like, like a bunch of businesses in Minneapolis just put out an open letter calling for the city to create a mental health emergency response system that's separate from the police. And those businesses were really speaking to like, concretely, we have these situations that come up at our business where somebody's experiencing a mental health crisis, or they are under the influence in a way that feels unsafe, and we don't want to call the police. We would like you to create someone else to call. And that feels so concrete to me. They're like, here's the thing that directly impacts us, and here's how we're going to speak on it and move on it. And I think for most institutions, if we're able to get it out of the like, what is our theoretical ideology about this, and into the like, how does this impact the day-to-day workings? Do you have a contract with MPD? Do you have people on staff who've been harmed by MPD? Do you have private security? Do you have ways that your organization operates that replicate policing, or sort of, like those kinds of conversations can get somewhere productive much more quickly than the like, what is your grand political perspective? And so finding ways to start the conversation there, I think can be really helpful.
Thanks for that, you two. All right, so we're gonna hop back to Julie for just 1 minute. If Julie, you wanna kind of catch us up with where you are in your art piece, and then I'm gonna hand the floor over to Tabitha for our closing here.
Hi, I'm back.
Hi, Julie.
So it was so great to listen and just keep working. I just, it hasn't changed much, just kind of developing the shape a little more. I just want to, I'm really thankful for DA and Lex and the insight into these issues, because I live in South Minneapolis too. And, it's really great that people are looking and paying attention, because artists, can kind of drift off into their own world. So I thank you for that. And just hope that this somehow feels relevant, this painting.
Well, thank you, Julie. I will definitely say that it does. I think that part of what we're hoping to do on multiple levels here with this summit is to understand that how we express ourselves, how we show up in community, how we think about issues, large and small, evokes a lot of different emotions. And so artists of all ilks, I think, can certainly appreciate in your painting, your rendering, your interpretation of all the things that we heard tonight, I think is reflective of how to hold multiple things and tensions and the depth of that in a variety of ways, not just our voices, right? And not just with what we're saying. So we are appreciative of your spending some time with us tonight. Listen, let me scoot on over with my round of thank yous, because that's really all I'm attempting or intending to do. Big shout out to Lily, who is, again, guys, literally a whole month in of being a board member, and raised her hand and said, yes, I will moderate the summit, and did an amazing job doing that. I think I truly appreciate you, Lily, because I think that what I'm about to say speaks to my appreciation for the panelists in terms of the tone that you set and the tone that they kept. Truly, the difficulty sometimes that I find in terms of having meaningful conversation is reflective of the nature of the conversation itself. But I tell you what, for those who are listening, and I hope you feel this way, is that there's not anything that we can't talk about when we do it with respect. when we acknowledge the humanity in each other. And Lex, thank you for giving of yourself in that way, and DA of yourself in that way. It's not about us all having the same points of view or opinion, but how we deliver those points of views and opinion matter. And so I'm grateful for each of you tonight for all of that and more. I appreciate everyone who attended. Thank you for showing up and showing out with us this week. We are one session away from culminating our first annual summit with the generous support of the Graves Foundation. A big shout out to our advisory council members who have supported us and helped advise us in terms of what this could look like along the way. We are grateful for you and all of your support. That includes Julie Guidry with the Upstream Arts Organization, and Becky Tim and Carla Goodwin over at the Graves Foundation, and Jay Hoon, who certainly Lex knows as a part of Reclaim the Block. So we are appreciative of all of the support. Listen, we are at time. And I should say, as I hate to be remiss, shout out to the most amazing group of women that I have ever had the pleasure to work with in all of my life, in all of my days. And so big ups to Hannah and Ashley and Grace for continuing to hold me down, even in a pandemic. Yo, appreciate y'all for life. You gotta know it. I hope you feel it. I will say it until I'm blue in the face. I appreciate you so much. And with that, we are at time. And if you are planning to come back for our 6 o'clock session, you will not be remiss. It's about self-care and wellness. We're gonna go deep, and we're appreciative of NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, and the Cultural Wellness Center will be anchoring that conversation. We appreciate you. We see you. Have an amazing weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.